Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to set up a proxy on Azure. Now this is similar to a VPN. Last time we looked at how to set up a VPN on a device, be it a tablet, a laptop, or a phone that you can use for encrypting all the traffic on your device and sending that up to a VPN server. And that basically encrypts all of the data and establishes a point of presence online that is coming from where the VPN server lives, not from where your device is actually located. And this is good when you're out and about, like if you want to get some kind of a point of presence, if you're traveling abroad, or if you're out and about, you just want privacy and security when you're at a place like a coffee shop, hotel, or an airport. This is certainly a good way to do it with a VPN. Now, a proxy works similar to that, but the way that it works is specifically around HTTP based traffic, which for most apps and for web browsing is what you're going to be using anyway. So this is an alternative to a VPN, and it has some advantages and disadvantages, but it's certainly one of the options that you can use. And Azure provides an easy way to do this. I'm going to show you how to do this, but first I'm going to look at kind of the technical implementation of this and how I'm going to set it up, and then I'll walk you through how to do it in the Azure portal. And one of the easiest ways you can do this is with an SSH server. Now, SSH, of course, most people are familiar with that from the Linux context, is basically a secure shell, but it comes with a lot of other features as well that basically allows you to set up things like SOCKS proxies and other port forwarding technologies that are built into SSH. So you have to enable it on the server, but once it's enabled, what you can do with an SSH server is basically set up a SOCKS proxy and then configure your local browser to use that SOCKS proxy for internet browsing. And anything else that uses a SOCKS proxy can obviously take advantage of that. So this would be your local box, and it's going to connect over a secure shell into that SSH server, which in this case is going to be running in a container. So this would be a Docker container running on Azure Container Apps. And now Container Apps gives you a very easy way to spin up containers in an Azure context. And you can configure these to accept TCP traffic inbound. And once that traffic's inbound, then you can treat it just like you would as if it was running on a server. The biggest advantage of that is that you don't have to maintain the server. Another cool thing about Container Apps is there's a certain allocation per month that is free. So you can have up to so many minutes of time per month that is free for use for whatever you want. And this would actually work well within that context, because this is only going to use fractional parts of a CPU and actually the memory allocated for you. So you're not going to exceed that if you're the only person using it, because SSH has very low overhead and it's very tight in terms of what it does for computational resources and so on. So once the SSH gets that traffic, it will decrypt it from the SSH and then put it out onto the internet. So it works like a proxy in that case. And this becomes your proxy server in this case. So this is a pretty straightforward way of setting this up. So I'm going to show you how to set this one up first on Azure Container Apps. And then from there, we'll use another method that's going to look something like this, but it's a little bit more involved because it's going to work for instances where something like SOCKS proxies aren't available. So I'm here in the Azure portal, and this is where I can create these resources. I'm going to hit create a resource right here, and then I'm going to search for Container App. And now Container App is the smaller unit. It needs a Container App environment. We can create both of these at the same time in this wizard right here. Now, in this particular one, we're just going to create the basics right here on the basics tab. Now, I'm going to create a new group here. I'm going to call it proxy demo. And you can see that's mine right there, called SSH proxy. But in any case, I'm going to call this one, this particular one called SSH server. And this is where I'm going to stick my SSH server instance. Now, I need to set up a container app environment. So the architecture for this is pretty basic. It's got a container app environment that has multiple container apps. Now, each container app can have multiple containers in there, and then each container can have multiple instances of that container. So you basically have 3 layers that you can work with in this. I'm going to be working with a container app environment with 2 container apps when I'm finally done with this, but our first pass at this is just an SSH instance. So I'm going to create a new one here, and there's some things that we need to turn on because the defaults aren't going to work for what we're trying to do. So the basics are fine. So if I just go to proxy-ce, which is going to work for this, I can take that. It's this networking tab that I need to pay attention to. So I'm going to create my own virtual network. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call it a proxy vnet, which is fine for this one. And this is you can attach it to an existing one if you have it already. I'm just going to take the defaults on this, and then I'm going to get an infrastructure subnet. So this is for the infrastructure that it's going to create. And so I need to create this one so that it can have a subnet to bind these apps to. So this is needed because of this option right here, which is external exposed hosted apps to the internet accessible IP address. So basically we need this so that we can have a public IP address to connect to. Now, if you're just working with HTTP, you don't need this. It'll just use the Azure infrastructure, and it'll use hostname to resolution to point it to your app, and that works fine for HTTP based applications. But this is using TCP with SSH, so we need to have a publicly accessible IP address. So that's why we need to turn all this on. So once that's enabled for external and I have that set up, I'm going to click create. Now the next tab is where I actually set up the app itself. So I'm going to be using a container that I created for this purpose, but I'm going to show you the GitHub repo for this. I'm going to uncheck this right here and not use the quick start image. I'm going to use a Docker Hub or other registry, and it's a publicly accessible one because I'm going to be using this image right here. This is one I just built for this. Now I've customized the similar images for other reasons, but I made this one so it's kind of generic for proxy. So this one is based off of another image that's kind of a generic image. So it's just Blaze Docker Open SSH Server. To show you what this looks like, I'm going to go to One Mule on GitHub right here, and this is me on GitHub right here. And I recently just created this repo right here called Docker Open SSH, and it was forked from another repo that it comes from something that's maintained by linuxserver.io. And linuxserver.io is the one that created this originally. I just modified the Docker file for this to expose some of the options that you need for setting up TCP tunnels inside of SSH, because they're not enabled by default on the base image that I derived this from. So basically just modify this to allow for agent forwarding, allow for TCP traffics, allow for gateway ports, and X11 forwarding. So this basically turns on the proxy features that come built into an SSH server, which is what we need. And so I enable all those, rebuilt the image, and then that's what got pushed right here. And that's the one I'm using. So there's no black magic here. I just basically used a publicly available image and modified it slightly for my purposes so that you could have a proxy server. Now, the reservations on this, you can use the base right here, quarter of a CPU, half a gig of RAM, which is more than enough to run an SSH server. Now, the environment variables for this are important. So we need to set these up, and I'm going to set these up using some of the options that come from the README on this. So if we come back over here to the README, we can see that this is going to work for this down here. And the options are in this particular Docker Compose file, but I definitely need to turn some of these on. Now, I do want to enable password access because I'm going to use a password for this. So I'm going to set this to true. And then back over here, I'm going to say user password. And you can use a secret for this if you want to, but I'm just for test purposes here. I'm going to use test123 for the password. Not a great password, but you get the point. And then the username is the username I'm going to set up for this. And so I'm going to turn on username, and I'm going to use Blaze for the username. So these three options will set up the security on this. If you want to use some of the options for this, like if you don't want to use that, you can actually use just public key authentication for this. So you just basically put your public key into this guy, and then you can leave off the password authentication, and it will just connect if it recognizes your public key on the server, which is fine too. So you can set that up. It's very easy to do. I'm just going to use the password rather than sharing the public key. Either one would work. But for my purposes here, I'm just using the password authentication, which is going to set this up. Now I'm going to set up the ingress down here to enabled, and I'm going to set TCP, and I'm going to say target port is 22. That's the target port for the backend container, and the exposed port is 22, which is the default on SSH. You can see that this one is exposing 2222, but for the exposed port, I'm going to say 22. Now, if you want to use another port like port 80 or port 8080, if you want to push that over the standard HTTP ports, you can definitely do that as well. There's nothing magic about that. It's just doing some port forwarding on the back end here. And this is going to attach it to that public IP address. So once we have that enabled, we also need to say accept traffic from anywhere as well, so that it will be out on the public internet for this particular option. So once these are all set up, we can come over here to the review and create, and it's going to validate all these settings. And once the settings are validated, you can click create, and that's going to deploy this particular proxy server, this open SSH proxy server, to this container app environment. And this takes a few minutes to do. It's not terribly long because it's a pretty small container, but once this is up and running, we'll come back and I'll show you how to connect your local environment to this particular SSH server. Okay, it looks like my deployment finished. So I'm going to go to the resource, and this is the container app that now that it's up and running. Now it's going to have the application URL. This is just the name of the SSH server on the public IP address, which is what I need to connect to it. So to make this thing connect, I'm going to launch terminal, which is going to give me a new terminal. Now to set up a proxy, it's pretty straightforward. You don't really need a lot of special commands or a lot of things. You can do it in one line on the command line using SSH. So SSH is installed with Windows 10 and Windows 11. So it's pretty widely available on Linux as well as Mac OS. So the command for this is the same regardless of what terminal you're using. You could use Mac OS, Linux, Windows, doesn't matter. It's the same command. And so the next thing you do is you set up the port that you want to set up your proxy on. So I haven't talked about this part, but we're going to use the -d parameter. So I'm going to set up this port on port 1337, which is short for elite if you're in elite speak, but in any case, it's a commonly used port for dynamic port forwarding or for SOCKS proxies, what we're setting up here. So this will take the local port of 1337 and forward that to the server. Then, so this is going to encrypt the traffic using SSH and then tunnel it through to this SSH server on that port. And then it's going to come to the SSH server. It's going to decrypt it, and it's going to look like all my traffic is coming from the server and not from my local client on that port. However, the port I'm going to connect the SSH server is completely different. So that's where I'm going to paste in this host name right here. And I'm going to put in the username that I supplied it when I created the SSH proxy. And this is going to connect it. So I need to say SSH-D, the port number I want to forward, and then the username at, then the host name. And that host name is what I copied from the portal over here. And this is going to say, do you want to add this? I'm going to say yes. And then I'm going to type in that password, which was test123123. And now I have a connection to SSH. There's nothing on this container other than SSH. So you can doink around in it if you want to. But in any case, you need to leave this connection open. So you just basically minimize this guy. And now we're going to adjust the network settings on the machine, which is pretty straightforward. So what you want to do with this is go to your control panel. Now, you can find proxy settings elsewhere, but we need to go to the control panel to go to internet options here. And then we're going to open this up. And then we're going to go over here to connections and LAN settings. Now, you'll have to dig around on how to do this for your particular operating system. But for Windows, it's always right here. It has been since like Windows 98 and Windows 95. So you can say use this proxy for LAN. I'm going to select yes. And I'm going to come to the advanced settings here. I have this set up for another proxy. So let's clear those out. And then I'm going to uncheck this box. And I'm just going to put this right here, localhost. And then I'm going to put in that same port number, 1337 or 1337, and just leave this as SOCKS localhost 1337. Click OK, and then click OK. And then you don't have to close this window, but it's set. Everything is set. Everything's ready to go. So if I come over here and then go to what is my IP address, I can look that up, and I should get that I'm coming from a Microsoft IP address now. So this is the IP address. So you can see that it's coming from Microsoft. Now let's just run a speed test on this for good measure, just to show you that it's actually pretty performant because SSH actually does a little bit of compression. I actually get more throughput doing this right here than if I was just using my internet connection. Otherwise, I would get about 250 because it's doing compression. I actually get more throughput in this case using an SSH tunnel, which is kind of odd. But in any case, you can see that it's pretty fast, even with the SSH tunnel in the mix. So I'm getting 5 millisecond ping times with decent throughput on a very modest container. So again, very easy to set this one up. Now I'm going to show you another way to create a proxy. Now this is going to use a different method for proxying, but the reason that we're going to use this method is because if you try to use this in a mobile context, it won't work because most mobile devices don't support SOCKS proxies for their proxy settings. They will only support straight up standard HTTP based proxy. So we need to set up an HTTP based proxy. We're still going to use an SSH tunnel, but we're going to expose the proxy in a different way. So let's walk through how this one looks, and then I'll show you how to set it up both on a Windows device and on an Android device. So for the next proxy we're going to set up, we're going to actually use the same container app environment. We're also going to end up using the same SSH tunnel, but instead we're going to add Squid to the mix. Now Squid is just a straight up HTTP proxy. It's a purpose-built proxy rather than a SOCKS proxy, what we just used with the SSH server. Now, the reason that we still want to use the SSH server is so that the traffic from the device into the container app environment is encrypted. And so the HTTP traffic is still going to be very secure using this. And so you still get that point of presence. You can proxy things publicly, but it's not going to be as secure as using something like an SSH server in the mix. So what this will allow us to do is create an SSH tunnel back to this SSH server. So all the traffic is encrypted over this context, but then we will forward the HTTP traffic onto Squid right here. And then Squid will just serve as a standard HTTP based proxy. And then everything from there will then go out to the internet just using the HTTP proxy protocols. And again, that all happens in the context of a container app environment. So this will be a container app right here. This will be a container app as well. And they're all operating in the same container app environment. So we're going to set up another container app to install this guy, which is going to build on the same container app environment that we already used to set up this guy. So I'm here in the Azure portal. I'm going to go to create resource again, and I'm going to punch in container app, and that's going to give me the option to create a new container app. I'm going to click create here. And this is going to use the same container app environment that I've already used, but I'm going to give it a different name. So I'm going to call it Squid in this case. And notice it's using the same container app environment right here. So I'm doing EastUS2, it's using the same container app environment and the same resource group. And so I don't need to recreate the container app environment. I don't need to recreate the network or any of that. I'm just using what's already there. We already did that when we set up the SSH server. So on the next one, this is where I'm going to get the stuff that's particular to the actual container I'm going to be using. So again, I'm not going to be using a quick start image. I'm going to use something from Docker Hub, and it's going to be a public image. And this is going to be using Ubuntu Squid. Now, Squid has already been built. I don't need to make any kind of changes to Squid to make this work. It's just out of the box. This will work just like we intended. So Squid is going to be using this image from Ubuntu. So you can just put that in here, and that's all you need. You don't have to set up any environment variables. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You can use this particular configuration for the resources, a quarter CPU, half gig of RAM. Now we do need to set up egress on this guy, limited to the container app environment. We don't want to put this on a public proxy, and we're going to set up the TCP, and we're going to use port 3128 for this guy. And we'll need to know what that is in a moment, but we just need to set up this. We don't need to accept traffic from anywhere, just to the container app environment, because the traffic is going to be coming from the SSH server into this rather than the other way around, where we have a publicly exposed endpoint on 3128. So the SSH server is still going to proxy this, but it's going to forward the HTTP proxy to the Squid proxy, and then it's going to then go out from Squid. So we don't need tags, and then just review and create. and then create using the create button here, and that's going to create the container. So we'll wait for this to deploy and we'll come back when it's done. Okay, now that my resource is deployed, let's just go take a look at this. This is just the Squid container app. This is nothing special, it's just the overview. Now in my container app environment, I can see that I have 2 apps installed. Now, this is the same SSH server I've already set up. Now, we set up a SOCKS proxy on this guy, which is a different protocol that will work for any number of different things that support that protocol. Now, this particular one just basically encapsulates all the TCP traffic and then re-emits it on the other end, and it's encrypted, but it's all built into the SSH server and the SSH client. And then the browser itself supports the protocol as well. But in the case of the mobile device or something that doesn't support the SOCKS proxy, you can still use a standard HTTP proxy, which is what Squid is, but we still need to get the traffic to Squid in a secure manner. So for that, we're going to use a port forward from the device to the SSH server, and then the SSH server will then re-emit the traffic in the local environment to Squid, and then Squid will actually be the proxy server in this case. So it's a little bit more layered, but it gets you the same result, and it will work on mobile devices as well. So let's go over to our command line, and I'll show you how to set this guy up. So let's use SSH again. I'm going to use SSH, and I'm going to use the -L command this time, or parameter, instead of -D. -D is for forwarding the SOCKS protocol. Now this is just going to use a standard TCP port forward. So I need to tell it what port I want to forward. And I'm going to use locally port 3128. Now I then need to tell it where I want to send this on the other end. So you just use an IP address or the name of the host. In this case, it's Squid, which is the name of the container app host I'm going to be sending this to. Then I need to tell it what port on Squid I'm going to forward this to. And again, it's going to be 3128. So this is saying forward my local port 3128 to Squid on the other end on its port 3128. And then everything after this is just standard SSH connection. So Blaze at the name of the host, which I'm going to grab right here. And that's all I need. And set this connection up. I'm going to supply the same password, test 123, 123. And that's going to say, welcome to SSH tunnel. Now, once you're connected, now we can set up the proxy locally here. Now, the proxy is still in the same place that we looked at before. So if you go to Internet Properties on the control panel, you can click on LAN settings right here, use a proxy settings right here. You can bypass for local address if you want to. Now, this is still set for the SOCKS proxy. So we're going to use localhost. And then we're going to say port 3128. Then I'm going to check this box here. And that's going to use the same proxy server for all protocols that it supports, HTTP, secure, and FTP. Secure is HTTPS. So this works for unencrypted and encrypted traffic. So click that. Now click OK, and now everything is set. So if everything goes well, what we should see now is what is my IP address? And we should get the same IP that we had a minute ago because it's coming from Microsoft Corporation. But in this case, I'm using HTTP proxy instead of a SOCKS proxy. And so it's all going through Squid. So let's do a speed test on this to see how it works. See how I run the speed test. And it's not too bad. It's about 300 down and probably about 10 up like we saw before. Now, this is probably going to introduce a slight bit of latency because it's using another layer. And the extra layer will always add a little bit of extra latency to it, and proxying tends to do that. But otherwise, the speeds look pretty decent or pretty similar to what we saw before on a speed test. It still only has 5 millisecond latency, which isn't too bad, actually. So very similar results to what we saw before, but in this case, we're working with HTTP proxies instead of a SOCKS proxy. Now, that extra layer is a little bit more complex, and I still prefer to use SOCKS because it's easier to set up, but in any case, it's very easy to do. Now, I'm going to show you how to set up the same thing using an Android device because SOCKS proxy on an Android device isn't supported, but you can still use HTTP proxy using basically the same process, but instead, we're going to use an app to set up an SSH tunnel, and then we're going to use the system settings to set up all of the proxy settings. So open up Play Store and type in ConnectBot, install the app. It's pretty straightforward. There are other apps you can use this for, but this one's free and it works just fine. So open that up and install it. And once you have it, you can then click on add a new connection. And then you type in the username that we put into the SSH server, and then put @ and then paste in the name. I recommend emailing it to yourself so you don't have to type in all of that long host name. And you can see there are other options in this, but again, we're not using these. These are just what you can do with this. But once you're done with that, you can hit the plus icon in the top right, and that will add the thing in, add the host name in. Now hold your finger down on the host name, and that will bring up the port forward. And then we're going to add a port forward, and we're going to put in the nickname for this. I'm just calling it proxy right there. And it's a type local. So that's that -L parameter. My local port is going to be 3128. And then the destination, of course, is Squid : 3128, just like we did when we were doing this on the command line. And so once you have that, you can click the checkbox in the bottom right and then hit the back arrow, and that will take you back to this screen, and then just tap on connect. And then of course you're going to allow it, and then allow this to use the connection. And then eventually it should prompt me for the password. Now I'm going to punch in the password, which is super secure test123 test123, and click enter. And now it's connected. Now, once that's connected, we need to configure the proxy settings on this. So go to your Wi-Fi settings under more settings. This is basically the advanced options here. I'm going to tap on Wi-Fi, and you should see an option for proxy, and tap on the proxy settings, and then add one manually. And then you might have to scroll a little bit to see that. And then you put in the host name, which of course is localhost because this is using SSH. And then port is then be 3128. And that's good to go. And then once you tap that, you're connected. And then go back to your browser, and then you can type in what is my IP address, and figure out what your IP address is. And this one is coming again from Microsoft. So you can see that this is a pretty useful way for connecting to the internet. You can use a VPN, of course, but this will show you two other ways that you can do that using a SOCKS proxy, or you can use an HTTP proxy with an SSH tunnel to that. Either method will work regardless of whatever context you're in. So if you're out and about, you want to have options available. This will give you security and privacy, whether you're at a coffee shop, you're at a hotel or an airport, wherever you might be using the internet. So again, consider this or a VPN for those purposes.
If you like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel by clicking on the subscribe button. You can also like this content by clicking on the thumbs up, or share this content with your friends, and also comment in the comment section down below. You can also find me online at www.blaze.net or on Twitter at @TheOneMule. And as always, thanks for watching.